Hey there, I'm Andrew Jang. Welcome back. So this is the story I've been dreading having to do, and I'll show you. First it was this. Twitter labels CBC account as government-funded media. Then, yesterday afternoon,
some breaking news to tell you about. CBC is pausing its activities on Twitter.
Now, CBC takes issue with the label government-funded media, seeing it as a kind of Twitter shorthand, like a jab at its independence, given how Twitter defines government-funded, which includes this, that media outlets, and I'll read it, that may have varying degrees of government involvement over editorial content. Now, CBC's tweet on its corporate account yesterday, "Our journalism is impartial and independent. To suggest otherwise is untrue. That is why we are pausing our activities on Twitter." But here's what happened next. Twitter CEO Elon Musk seems to have interpreted CBC's position as being that the label is incorrect because not all of its funding comes from taxpayers. So Musk's reply, just trying to be accurate, would they be okay if we said 70% government funded? He then posted a screenshot of CBC's new label. You can see at the bottom there, 70%. But then another user suggested it might be funnier to write 69% instead of 70 because it's a funny number. And that brings us to today, where indeed CBC's account bears the label 69% government-funded media. Now, maybe you now think you know why I was dreading doing this episode, but it's really only just because it's sort of awkward and uncomfortable to report on where you work. That being said, as a show, our promise is to talk about all the things that you're talking about. And yeah, this story has come up a few times, and we saw it, most of it, coming from a mile away.
Twitter has labeled NPR as state-affiliated media.
A designation traditionally that's been reserved for foreign media outlets that represent the official views of the government of those countries, like Russia's RT or China's Xinhua.
PBS and BBC were given similar labels.
This is the latest move against established media institutions from the social media company.
So it's like how during the pandemic, Twitter began actively labeling some posts as misinformation, right? And it did the same sort of thing with tweets disputing the outcome of the last US presidential election. Labels are a way for Twitter to still allow content on the platform, but warn people about it, so untruths don't go unchecked. But when Twitter labeled National Public Radio in the US as state-affiliated media, that, according to NPR, was going too far.
NPR leaves Twitter. The news outlet will no longer post on the platform after Twitter labeled it state-affiliated media.
NPR pushed back on that, saying it operates independently of the U.S. government and that Twitter is trying to undermine its credibility.
The tag was later changed to government-funded media, but NPR still saw this as an attack. And rather than live with the label, NPR quit Twitter, went dark on all of its 52 accounts. Same thing happened to PBS. It got labeled as government-funded and quit. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation was given that label too. Same with BBC last week.
Now, social media giant Twitter has labeled the BBC as government-funded media.
Yeah, BBC branded government-funded on Twitter. So Elon's gone into their account and put a little note on there saying that they're government-funded.
And we're going to talk more about the BBC later, but following the BBC's label, here in Canada, the leader of the official opposition, Pierre Poilievre, whose position on the CBC is pretty clear.
Well, I will defund the CBC. This is a colossal waste of money, over $1 billion for a bloated corporation.
He sent a letter directly to Elon Musk asking for CBC to be given the same government-funded designation.
We need a neutral and free media, but not a propaganda arm for the Liberal Party.
And here we are. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is mostly publicly funded, just to be clear, but now on Twitter officially labeled as government-funded. So what's the big deal? Why are these media organizations getting so pissed off? And on the flip side, do those labels actually maybe make sense?
I know the BBC, for example, is not thrilled about being labelled state-affiliated media.
Not exactly. I was going to get to that later, but let's go for it now. It's officially objected to that term. Do you want to respond to it?
Yeah. So our goal is simply to have to be as truthful and accurate as possible.
Like, it's certainly true that politicians, Parliament, decides how much funding CBC gets. And ultimately, it's about 2/3 of CBC funding that is public funding. The rest is actually just like any other private media organization. There's ad revenue, subscriber fees, that sort of thing. But CBC's position is that even so, it isn't technically funded by government. CBC Radio-Canada is publicly funded through a parliamentary appropriation that is voted upon by all members of Parliament. Translation, Parliament decides, not government. Now, we should point out here that, yes, if the party in power controls a majority of seats in Parliament, then presumably it would win any parliamentary vote and, yes, effectively have control over CBC's funding. But in a minority government situation, the distinction matters a lot more. But set that aside. Twitter's policy also states government-funded media is defined as outlets where the government provides some or all of the outlet's funding. And NPR has argued there's a big difference between some and all. It has the government-funded media tag on Twitter, but says a huge chunk of its funding actually comes from listeners directly, almost half of all of the money it gets. Corporate donors also give to NPR. Colleges and universities support it as well. There are investments, foundations that generate revenue. Then at the bottom of the list is federal money. On average, NPR says less than 1% of its revenue comes from federal grants. And there are, plenty of private media companies out there in this country that also get federal money through, other funds and grants like the Canada Media Fund. So the organizations hit with the government-funded label, for them, this doesn't feel like a consistently applied statement of fact. NPR in particular has said it feels that this is more like an attack made selectively to mislead Twitter users about the quality of news. Basically, they say, the label gives the wrong impression. And implied is that a news organization that gets funding through the government can't be trusted to speak truth to power. I mean, Pierre Poilievre tweeted that point himself. CBC officially exposed as government-funded media. Now people know that it is Trudeau propaganda, not news. Now, typically, when we talk about state broadcasters, that's sort of exactly what we mean.
One civilian is killed and 7 wounded in Donetsk after Ukrainian shells hit an Orthodox church in the middle of an Easter service early on Sunday.
走进荔枝种植园，了解当地发展特色种植产业和文旅产业等情况。
There are some media organizations out there like Russia Today, RT, or China Central Television, CCTV, that are widely considered to be direct mouthpieces of government. They're known for promoting government policy, lacking editorial independence, and are heavily influenced by their respective authoritarian regimes. At worst, they actively spread lies and misinformation to toe the government line.
A source quoted in this Russia Today documentary calls Ukrainian soldiers tools of the U.S. government.
Sent to the front line.
And when media personalities who work for state broadcasters dare to speak out against government, there are always severe consequences. Getting fired is maybe the lightest punishment there is, because you could be interrogated, detained, arrested, jailed, or worse. Now, CBC is a crown corporation, wholly owned by the state, but it's an independent crown corporation. Now, I told you earlier I was going to share CBC's official position with you. Here it is. The CBC's editorial independence is protected in law in the Broadcasting Act, and in addition, our journalism is independent and subject to our journalistic standards and practices, as well as an independent complaints process through the Ombudsman for CBC and Radio-Canada. So, the Broadcasting Act, which governs the CBC, repeatedly emphasizes that the CBC should not be under the control or influence of any political authority. And one section says, the corporation shall enjoy freedom of expression and journalistic, creative, and programming independence. The JSP, the Journalistic Standards and Practices, that is like a code of conduct, which, you can actually Google it, you can read it online, and it governs everything that CBC journalists do. How they conduct responsible interviews, how they deal with conflicts of interest, handling language, live situations, sources, social media. And if that code is broken, there's a whole process for an ombudsman, an independent watchdog, to analyze whether or how those standards were violated and what consequences there should be. Critics of public broadcasters openly question, can any news organization receive money from those in power without being beholden to them? And, that would be a really interesting debate to have, which I'm not going to have with myself here and now, but that's kind of the point, that everything we've discussed is a big conversation getting reduced to a label. Now, there's an old joke in journalism school, that, you could openly accuse a politician of anything. You could ask the question, did you steal $1 million? To which they would, of course, instantly say, no, I didn't. But then you could plaster all over the front page with a big splashy headline, local politician denies stealing $1 million. Like, even if the headline is accurate, it's built on a foundation of bad faith. And to anyone skimming the headlines, the impression it leaves is really bad. So that government-funded media label, is it true? Well, that's actually kind of hard to answer. Is the implication fair? Well, that you can decide for yourself. Last thing, when this story first broke, the Canadian press says that it reached out to Twitter for comment. It got a poop emoji in reply. The government-funded label on the BBC and the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, that has been changed to publicly funded. On NPR and CBC, it still says government funded. And tomorrow, who knows?